When we started planning for our library expansion, we had plenty of funds available to cover the expense, assuming we used a grant writing consultant to leverage our assets. We still hope to do this, but inflation and prices for building materials continue to wreak havoc in the total building cost. It occurs to me that we might have to supplement what we have available to us. What are some of the tricks and suggestions of how to organize and implement a successful local fundraiser in a small community? Okay, so before I get into the fundraising part of this, a couple suggestions and just an affirmation that construction costs at the best of times are always tricky, and especially in this last year, with everybody redoing houses and landscaping, etc. It has been a nightmare in terms of trying to keep costs low for capital sort of projects. So, um, a note on inflation and using cost urgency. When you are trying to do an assortment of fundraising, donor awards, grants, etc., the problem is that the grants part, well, and the fundraising part takes time. And so there's, even at the best of times, always that issue of building materials becoming more expensive. So using that urgency as a motivator can be helpful. So thinking of it and using it in grants, for example, they are usually, even if it's not officially on the scoring rubric, they do tend to pay attention to which projects have a sense of urgency, which sort of intangibly affects the scoring in terms of, well, they clearly need the money, not only in terms of they met all of the rubric stuff, but they need the money now because this painting is disintegrating or this roof is going to collapse in, that kind of thing. So using the cost of construction and the inability to build the building at some point once it becomes too expensive is a point of urgency that you can sort of use in your favor in the grant application, but also in talking with funders to help motivate them to reach the fundraising goal, whatever it is, more quickly. Okay, time out here real quick. In recording this webinar, I realized I completely forgot to address the contingent contract bullet point. And this idea I want to make sure we get down because when working with construction companies, and especially if you are a nonprofit organization or a municipal organization, somewhere where your budgets and your funds are fairly strict, sometimes partnering with or finding a construction company you can partner with that understands and supports that situation can really be helpful in these types of situations. So whether that is putting into place a contingent contract where you commit to working with that company, assuming that the funding comes in, and that way sort of locking in some of the costs ahead of time is sometimes an option. Another thing you can do that I've seen be successful is when you're partnering with construction companies, and especially those local to your organization, they also have an investment in your organization being successful. And there are sometimes compromises that you can strike or negotiations made in terms of, okay, we can pay for materials up to this price. At that point, is there a way we can do it at cost, or is there an option where some of the cost could possibly be donated and so therefore a tax write-off for that construction company? So, there is some room where we can get creative, and assuming that you have a good partner to work with, I have seen each of those examples in action, so worth a try. Okay, time back to the original presentation. Speaking of in answering your actual question, the local community fundraising, I find that a concise, like simple, open, and honest call is very compelling. So being honest and using that sense of urgency about the construction costs being astronomical, and being open about what it is that you need and how people can help you meet it. So, do you need to get $50,000 by, Q3 or what have you, or by November of this year, things like that. Why you're tell them the problem, why you're in that situation, the urgency around it, and how they can help you. So framing it in that way and using an honest approach. Also, things that have been popping up in conversations, especially among museums this last week at AAM, the knowledge and data around micro donations is getting better and better. And we are finding that in the museum setting for donations in general, that micro donations are becoming the majority of donations for most museums. And so while having donors with large amounts of money is certainly very helpful, not underestimating the power of people giving 20, 50, 100, what have you dollars, whatever it is that they can, it is still helpful. And so when you're putting out that call or organizing the whatever fundraising mechanism, making sure that those people feel empowered and that it really does help if they give that money, even if it is a smaller amount. So realizing and harnessing the power of micro donations. Also, make sure you find out a way to do it online because, while many donors are able to write checks, etc., the majority of the population at this point is now wanting to give donations online. So remember that. Another thing to think about is pledges versus cash in hand. And this can help get into the next point with competition, but going around and getting pledges can help in terms of getting people excited about it. They don't have to write the check right away, but it helps you build some momentum. And you can do that versus feeling like you need to have the cash in hand. So it's a way for you to move forward without having necessarily all of the cash together to then spend, because if you're trying to do that, you may never get there. And then this also helps with competition, especially if there are some local corporations, organizations, tourism boards, etc. Um, it can be very helpful to be transparent and share who else has given. And this is organizations and companies, not personal people, but as sort of an incentive to be like, well, the grocery store, etc., gave this, but the restaurant gave that. So, like, what could you do, kind of thing. Thinking about local foundations and funders, each state has their own very local foundations, and you can, if you have a library near you, there's usually books of funders that may not necessarily have their own website, but of course there's websites too that keep track of those databases. And figuring out which ones are local to you, because the more local they are, the more they will care about your local issue, which in this case with construction is going to be a building in their area that they could benefit from and the community could benefit from. Having events of course cost money. So I usually hesitate to recommend that, especially for organizations that may not normally do events to begin with. But they can be exciting, especially if they're a one-off, whether it's a lecture or fun community event. Maybe you can partner with a restaurant and have proceeds go towards the project, etc. Getting creative there where it wouldn't be a lot of cost outlay for you, but could help generate a lot of money. And then, of course, honoring. So, depending on what you're building and how many things you could name, naming the foyer was thanks to Jane Smith, for example, or, these beautiful bookcases or stacks were because of so and so, or even the bricks. In fact, I think those are some of the most popular because, again, people can buy in at a lower price, but their name is in a brick on the ground and people get really excited about that. um, it's they feel like they're a part of it, right? And so having different ways people can buy in and having different ways you can honor and recognize those contributions, all of those will help, especially when you're thinking about local community fundraising. So hopefully those ideas get you going.